So we have several presentations this afternoon, and I will be the first presentation. I will be joined shortly by my colleagues, Dr. Efrosyni Konstantinou, who is a senior lecturer at the Bartlett School of Sustainable Construction, and Professor Aeli Roberts, who is also from the Bartlett School of Sustainable Construction. I will just share my slides, and then we'll get started with the session. So you should now be able to see my screen. So today's session is called Women's and the Trust Penalty. And what I want to talk about with you over the next half hour is, well, first I want to talk a bit about inequality and gender inequality specifically in the workplace, why it's so hard to get to reduce and eliminate those inequalities. And then I'll go into what I did in my own research, which is looking at something I call the gender status mismatch as one of the reasons those inequalities endure. And then we'll wrap up the session by talking about the future of work and how gender inequalities in the workplace might be impacted by change in the labor market and in the way organizations are run. I will also leave plenty of time for questions. And so at the end of the session, there'll be an extended Q&A. Right, so workplace inequalities are multifaceted. What I mean by this is that they have a number of different origins. They're sticky. By that, I mean that they do not disappear easily. And I would go one step further. Inequalities that are in place tend to reproduce themselves again and again. And so short of tackling them actively, it is very difficult to reduce workplace inequality. And the origins of those inequalities are both in and out of the workplace, which is one of those things that makes it difficult to tackle, makes it difficult to tackle them. Gender inequality are one type of inequalities in the workplace, and similarly, they're multifaceted, sticky, and they have their origin in and out of the workplace. Our attitudes, our beliefs that we hold outside of the workplace are also taken with us inside the workplace, and they might be mitigated to an extent, but they do not disappear entirely in the workplace. Right, just to highlight that this is an important problem. This is a problem that is really salient in a lot of areas. Just a couple of days ago, the UN Secretary General made a speech in which he said, gender equality is still 300 years away. While this is a statement that we'd need to qualify, is thinking about gender inequalities in the world as a whole, not a specific country, there is, and it is also making a number of assumptions about the rate at which those inequalities are changing. This is a sign that not only do these inequalities still exist, but we're a long way from having fully resolved those inequalities. So what I'd like to do is just take a minute to think about where do gender inequality comes from? And some of that would be, for example, coming from cognitive biases. So cognitive biases are not particularly creating gender inequalities, but in certain contexts, they might lead. So cognitive biases are simply us making systematic error when we evaluate information because of the way our brain works. And in some contexts, they will amplify existing inequalities, specifically in our case, gender inequality. So for example, we know that in groups, we tend to perceive people who speak more as leaders. Now, if between men and women, there are different propensity to speak in a group, it might create gender inequality through the fact that we associate that speaking in a group with leadership. And therefore, we might perceive the gender that speaks the most as displaying more leadership qualities. And it turns out that not everywhere and always, but in a lot of contexts, men tend to be more ready to speak in groups than women. So another big source of gender inequality are culture and norms that shape our perceptions of the different genders, but they also shape our reaction to a mismatch between someone's gender and the expectations we have from that gender. And this is important because we'll see that that's what we come back to when we look at the gender status mismatch later in this session. And finally, self-selection might also create inequality where someone might make, because of their gender, someone might make decisions not to pursue certain careers or not to go in certain areas. This is not as a result of their gender, but it's as a result of, for example, being socialized in finding specific activities more acceptable for someone of a specific gender. And so self-selection is also shaped by culture and norms and cognitive biases. Right, so those are a few of the sources of gender inequality. Now, one thing that's very difficult is how do we measure gender inequality? We've said at the beginning that those inequalities were multifaceted, and that means there's not one overarching measure we can monitor to decide whether or not we've solved gender inequality. Having said that, looking at things like the gender pay gap can be good indicators of where we are on the way to reducing and eradicating gender inequalities in the workplace. The gender pay gap is not a perfect measure of gender inequality, but it has one big advantage, is that it's fairly easy to measure. So in short, the gender pay gap is the difference between wages of men and women in an economy. So let me give you a more precise definition, which is the definition that the Office of National Statistics uses in their questions in their calculation of the gender pay gap. The gender pay gap is the difference between average hourly earnings, excluding overtime, of men and women as a proportion of men's average hourly earnings, excluding overtime. And it's a measure across all jobs in the UK, not a measure of the difference in pay between men and women for doing the same job. And we'll get back to that later in this session. Even if we have perfect equality between men and women in terms of salary who do the same job, we might still have a gender pay gap and we might still have gender inequality in the workplace as a result of what we call occupational sorting. And I'll go into that a little bit more because that's potentially, especially as we get closer to reducing the gender pay gap and the differences in salaries paid to men and women, that might be one of the big things, occupational sorting, that is difficult to resolve and take times to resolve to get to true equality. So now that I've given you a short definition of the gender pay gap, I'd like to get your input, and I want you to guess. Don't Google it. Guess what the gender pay gap in the UK in 2021 was I've got results that I'll give you afterwards for both 2021 and 2022, but the results for 2022 are still provisional. In order to be able to vote, if you look at the top of the slide, you at the top of the slide, you've got the address www.menti.com. And if you go to that address and enter the code 42411514, you will be able to then access the voting platform. So I'll give you a couple of minutes for you to access this and try to vote, and then I'll reveal the results, and then we'll discuss those results briefly before continuing. So as people are trying to vote, what I'll do is just tell you the definition of the gender pay gap again, which is the difference in hourly earnings of women compared to the hourly earnings of men in this case in the UK economy. So I'll give you another 20 seconds to vote, and then I'll reveal the results of that vote, and then I'll go into looking at the actual data. So let me reveal the results. So according to the people who voted, the gender pay gap in the UK in 2021 is about 30%. There's quite a large distribution, with some people guessing that it's over 50%, and quite a big cluster around between 10 and 20%. So the gender pay gap in 2021 for all employees was 15.1%. And in the provisional 2022 data, it's 14.9%. And for full-time employee, it was a bit lower. It was 7.7% in April 2021 and 8.3% in April 2022. So this is lower than what most people guessed, but it's still a significant difference in hourly earnings between men and women, with a bigger difference when we look at all employees compared to just looking at full-time employees. So what I'd like to do now is look at the gender pay gap over time very briefly to show you what changes in that gender pay gap we've seen over the years. So if you look at this graph, this is a graph that gives us a sense of the change in the gender pay gap in the UK for a 25-year period. And you can see that it's been reducing over time, but the rate at which it reduces is quite slow, which means that we are still quite a distance from reaching parity on this. If we look in the US, so the US calculates, well, the Pew Research Center from which I got that data, calculate the gender pay gap slightly differently. But what you can see, going back a bit further than the UK data, we have 40 years of data, and essentially we are roughly, if we look at all workers age 16 and above, we are roughly at the same level of gender pay gap. today than we were in 2002. So the past 20 years have seen very, very little change in the US for when we look at all workers. However, the gap is smaller for younger workers, which that's encouraging. But again, what those things highlight is the difficulty of reducing gender inequalities in the workplace. And even when we look at something like salary, which is measurable, and we've been paying attention for a while, so we've been measuring those differences, they still seem to close those inequalities very, very slowly. Right, so why don't those inequalities disappear, even though we've been talking about them for a long time, and we've been actively, at least in the UK, actively tackling gender inequality in the workplace for the best part of the last 50 years. Why have we made progress, but haven't we been able to resolve them? So one of the first reasons, which I mentioned before, is this idea of occupational sorting. So if one of the gender, and in this case, if women are overrepresented in lower paying jobs, this will create a gender pay gap. The question that this raises is, do we think occupational sorting is normal? Should we expect men and women to choose different occupations in the economy? And my view on the matter is that we should not. We have very little evidence to suggest that there are jobs that men or women are better at doing than the other. And therefore, occupational sorting is part of the problem. And that's one reason, for example, why looking at whether people would do the same job, earn the same salary, is only part of reducing the gender pay gap and gender inequalities more widely, because for as long as occupational sorting exists, there might be a gender pay gap that is not eliminated by simply making sure that people who do the same job are compensated in the same way. Which is not to say that that shouldn't be the case. We should indeed, and I think that's a consensus view, we should reward people similarly for the same job, and we don't always do that today. But even if we got there, occupational sorting might be a source of gender pay gap that wouldn't be taken care of by this. Other things that make those inequalities endure, and specifically the gender pay gap, are things like unequal repartition of household work between men and women in the household. So we have, for example, very good evidence of a motherhood penalty, which is a long-term hit to income for women who have children. And there's a number of reasons for this, but essentially this is one of the sources of the gender pay gap. There's also conscious and unconscious biases, which would lead, for example, to a higher barrier to entry, because if there are, whether they're conscious or unconscious biases in hiring, it will be harder for women to obtain certain jobs, and then they might be promoted at a slower rate. All of this is contributing to maintaining the gender pay gap. And the last one, which is what I'm going to focus on in the rest of this presentation, and which is, I think, something that influences some of those other differences, is the gender beliefs. And gender beliefs are societal level beliefs we have as a society about expectations from men and from women, both in the workplace and outside of the workplace. So the work I'm going to describe in a bit more details is work I've done that specifically look at gender beliefs and try to find evidence of those influencing differences between men and women in the workplace. And specifically, in this case, we've looked at trust, and we found evidence of a trust penalty for women in the workplace. So to look at those gender status beliefs, we've developed the concept of gender status mismatch, and what that is essentially the mismatch is a situation in which someone has status that might be conferred by an organization. For example, they're a senior executive in that organization, that clashes with expectations that come with their gender and with the gender beliefs that we hold about that gender. And so, for example, this is a woman in an executive position might present a mismatch between her gender and the status that she has obtained within the organization. And what we hypothesize is that this mismatch is going to be detrimental. The dissonance that results from the mismatch is going to be detrimental to the ability of that individual to garner trust from colleagues in the course of doing their work. So what we've done is look at two sources of status that might be potential sources of mismatch for women in the workplace. We've been the work we've done was on a construction site in the UK at some point in the past decade, and we've looked specifically at two things. We've looked at seniority in the workplace, and then we've looked at network position. So, because I assume that most of you will know what being more senior in an organization mean, I might focus for a second about what I mean by network position, which is possibly a concept that a lot of you have not encountered before. So very briefly, we're all embedded in networks of relationships at work. We have colleagues with whom we collaborate, and through that collaboration, we exchange information, and we develop ties to those people. We have, and with those ties come expectations of what they can help us with, how we can help them, whether we like them or we don't, and a number of other things. What we can do is map that network. So there's a number of ways to do this. One way we've been doing this in this work is simply by asking people through a survey who they interact with in the course of doing their work. There are other ways you can collect network data. For example, organizations have a lot of metadata about people's network through, for example, their agenda, their emails, et cetera, but one traditional way of doing this is simply to ask people and look at who they work with and say, okay, amongst those people, who are people you are friends with? Who are the people you ask for advice? And you can ask a number of questions depending on what your focus is. Once you've mapped that network, we have a number of calculations we can do on the network to identify people with important position in the network. And one specific thing that is often done is looking at centrality. Identifying central an individual in a network has been a way of identifying key individuals in the network. And we're interested in one specific type of centrality in this case, which I'll give you the technical term before telling you what that means. We call it eigenvector centrality, but really what it is a measure of influence in the network. And in simple terms, you are going to be very central according to this measure if you are connected to other central individuals. And so essentially, influence comes from being connected to other influential individuals. So those seniority and the network position I just explained, those are the two things we looked at to see if we could see evidence of the gender status mismatch influencing how trusted people are in the workplace. So the first thing we looked at was looking at seniority. And if you look at the graph, you can see that in this graph, women that occupy junior positions tend to be more trusted than men. And that difference is significant. But once they are in a senior position, men and women, the difference in trust between men and women almost disappears. And when we look at the network, the picture is even more stark, where when we look at people who are not influential, so who have low network status, we see that women are significantly more trusted than men that are in the same position. But once we look at people that have a high centrality in the network, men are more trusted than women. And in that case, the differences between the two are significant, both at for the low status individual and for the high status individuals. And so what we find here, both for seniority and for network position, is evidence that gender status mismatch is hurting the how trusted women are in the workplace. So before I talk a little bit about how we can resolve or try to resolve the effect of the gender status mismatch, I just want to give one caveat. The data we had for that work was cross-sectional, which means we haven't measured people over time. So we can't say when in someone's career as they become more senior, do they start being less trusted. We just know that when we look at junior people, we see evidence that women on average are more trusted than men. And when we look at more senior individuals, we find no difference in how trusted they are. And when we do the same in the network, we find that more central individual in the network, women suffer a trust penalty there that is significant. So what can we do to tackle the gender status mismatch? So one of the main issues with the gender status mismatch, and I think possibly the main takeaway message from that presentation, is the fact that, well, gender inequality, because some of it relies on societal gender beliefs, they're not only in the organization. We can't tackle them just at the organizational level. And they need to be tackled at the individual and organizational level, but also at a societal level, which is one thing that makes them really difficult to tackle. And it also limits what organizations can hope to achieve on their own. This being said, there are a number of things that organizations can still do in order to attempt to reduce the effect of the gender status mismatch locally within the organization. So training and mentoring programs are one of those ways in which the gender status mismatch can be reduced within the organization, or at least the effect of that mismatch. And similarly, developing a culture of promoting women to leadership positions can be a way of lowering over time the effect of the gender status mismatch. It also makes it more likely that in an environment in which more women are in senior positions, in positions that initially are perceived as a mismatch with their gender, those gender beliefs will start to change, and that will then help reduce the inequalities further. Right, so I'm going to now talk a little bit about the future of gender inequalities in the workplace before wrapping up. one of the one of the things that is obvious but is worth saying is that the future of gender inequalities in the workplace is tied to what happens to work in the future. And there's two changes that I think are already happening or about to happen in the way we work and in the way organizations are built that is going to have an influence over the next, probably the next decade for sure, but most likely longer than that, over the next 2 or 3 decades. And those two things are the higher prevalence of hybrid working today compared to before the pandemic, and the higher availability of artificial intelligence technologies, especially with this year, the progress that have been made with large language models. Those have been around for a long time, but this year there's been a jump in their quality and in their ability to produce material that is hard to differentiate to material produced by a human. So first, I want to talk very briefly about hybrid working, and I think there's some challenges, but also some opportunities. So when we look at challenges in terms of gender inequalities, someone called Peter Capelli, who was a professor at Wharton, wrote a small book about the future of the office, in which he says hybrid is easier to do remotely for certain jobs compared to others. And he means specifically what he called individual contributors. Those are individuals whose work slot in quite easily with the work of others, even if they have limited interaction. So, and I think Capelli has a point. Well, then we see occupational sorting rear its head again, which means that if women are overrepresented in jobs that are not individual contributors jobs, well, then they'll be less able to take advantage of remote working opportunities, and that might exacerbate inequalities. The other challenges are open questions. What happens to relationships between employees if they're remote most of the time, or if they're remote some of the time? Do we see differential between what happens to the interactions and the networks created by men and by women? What does that mean for the trust penalty? Does the trust penalty, is it bigger or smaller when most of the interactions are online and are not face-to-face? What happens to, for example, differentials in speed of promotion between men and women when people are mostly working remotely? Another thing we know about hybrid working is that it tends to increase work hours, and this might be a problem for people who have caring responsibilities. And we know that today, at least, women tend to have more caring responsibility than men. And again, that's another way in which hybrid could exacerbate inequalities, gender inequalities. In terms of opportunities, more independence in work and additional flexibility, if it's done well, which is challenging, that would be compatible with, for example, more caring responsibilities, and it would enable people that would otherwise not be able to work full-time to work full-time and essentially organize their work around their caring responsibilities. We also know that there are productivity gains from hybrid working, so that's beneficial for the economy at large, and for organizations, hybrid working done in certain ways could lead, for example, to real estate savings and other savings that then those savings could be reinvested, for example, to tackle or partially reinvested to tackle inequalities in the workplace. So now, very briefly, let's talk about AI and what that might do to gender inequality. So one of the big promise of artificial intelligence, and especially of large language models, is productivity gains. So growth in productivity has slowed down dramatically over the past few years, and we're starting to see evidence from a number of studies that using large language models in work that require writing can lead to significant productivity gain. And those productivity gains could benefit both men and women. The other thing that the initial studies seem to show is that using those models reduces the differences between best and worst performers in the workplace. And this could be one way in which, well, it would be harder to differentiate between best and worst performers. But in terms of the way people are incentivized to work, this might lead to reduction in inequalities of salaries, and potentially that could benefit that could help reduce the gender pay gap. And again, the question of occupational sorting comes back: is do men and women, are they equally in position in occupations in the economy that will benefit from the productivity gain that we can expect for artificial intelligence? And if that's the case, then artificial intelligence will not exacerbate inequalities. But if men and women are differentially able to gain, to benefit from those productivity gain because of occupational sorting, then we might see an exacerbation of gender inequalities from the diffusion of artificial intelligence as tools in the labor market. Right, so those questions are some of the questions that me and others try to tackle in the research center that I direct, which is called KONA. This is a center that looks at or does research on organizational design, and one of the tools we use network analysis to better understand workplace dynamic. We think that the network of relationships that we're all embedded in the workplace are one of the big determinant of outcomes in the workplace, both organizational outcome, but also outcome at the individual levels in terms of their ability to be promoted over time and to be fairly rewarded for their work. And so we strongly believe that in order to tackle gender inequality in the workplace, we also need to understand how the networks that people are embedded in the workplace are either being a barrier to the reduction of inequalities, or how we can use them as catalysts to help diffuse, for example, new norms and new behaviors that in time reduce inequalities in the workplace. Right, I've talked for long enough, I think. And what I'd like to do now, before we jump into the Q&A, is ask you for what you think. What are the challenges that you've faced in the workplace around gender inequalities? And I'm interested both in challenges you might have faced as individuals, but also if you're a manager in an organization, what are your challenges in order to help reduce gender inequalities? What are the barriers that makes it difficult for you to do that? And what kind of help would you need in order to take more action? Right, I'll give I'll give you a couple of minutes for this. And I think while you do this, I think we've been joined by Professor Aeli Roberts and Dr. Efrosyni Konstantinou, who are two of my colleagues at the Bartlett School of Sustainable Construction, and they're going to help me run the Q&A. They'll also probably be there contributing their own questions. So welcome, Effie, and welcome, Aeli. Thank you very much for being there.
Great. Thank you very much, Antoine, for that. Very, very interesting. I like the term gender status mismatch very much. I think it describes experiences that I've had, and also I've seen in across other colleagues as well. We do have some questions. So I think before we talk about our own ideas based on your excellent presentation, let's look at what colleagues are saying. So Caroline Ward says, how does disability interact with gender in this case?
So thank you very much for that question. And I think, I mean, that's one of the big things when we look at gender inequalities is that it's very hard to look at gender inequality in isolation. Inequalities are multidimensional. You can't really tackle gender inequality without thinking about the effect of disability, without thinking about potentially inequality that comes from ethnic background, and therefore, as an organization, you need to think about those different dimensions, and you need to realize that they're going to interact. Often what we find in both in my own research, but in plenty of other people's research, is the fact that inequality people might be suffering from multiple type of discrimination. They might be suffering because of their gender, which might then be made worse by the fact that they have a disability that also affect them, or they're suffering from discrimination that is on the basis of their ethnicity, and then they also happen to be a woman, and those discrimination, those disadvantages compound with one another.
Okay, very nice. Thank you very much for that. And we have one more question from Jean. Jean is asking, which sectors did you collect data from? Was it just construction or cross-sector?
So the specific result I showed earlier are from the construction industry. I can't tell you exactly where, but it was a large construction project in the UK. At some point over the past 10 years.
Okay.
But this is one of the things we are doing within the center, is doing research across different industries to compare, to also get a sense of where does the construction industry fit compared to other industries in terms of its work to reduce gender inequalities in the workplace.
Okay, very nice. If I can ask one question, and then I don't know if Aeli has any comments. Antoine, what you're saying is very interesting, and I am wondering, in an institutional context where there are different priorities and different values of an organization or an institution, how does that relate to this idea of the gender status mismatch that you have found. So have you seen any particularly do you have any findings in terms of the relationship between the organization, or do we fall back to the traditional HR kind of dialogue and similar practices?
So let me just rephrase your question to be sure that I've gotten what you're asking.
Yeah.
You're asking me if there are, so at first I thought you were asking whether there are differences in that mismatch across different organizations and into the effect, or if you're asking about the way they're being tackled when they arise.
Yeah, within an organization.
Within an organization. So I think one of the things that's interesting, one of the things that's also potentially a bit dispiriting, is that none of the difference we saw in our data were things we were looking for between the because the organization that ran that project thought that they had gender inequality in their organization. They actually thought the opposite. They thought everything was well. And so this is something we find in an organization that appears to be well functioning, in an organization in which there is no overt contestation of, there's no one complaining that there is discrimination. There's no perception that the organization is discriminating, but we still find evidence of those differences. And that's one of the reasons why we think they come from the gender status beliefs that are a societal set of beliefs, is because they are accepted by the people that are facing those differences as normal.
Mm-hmm. So in a sense, the entire, all of these inequalities, they come into the organization with the people, and they escape the different systems that perhaps, or cultures that an organization might have in order to protect from those behaviors.
So I think, I mean, this is the first step, is for organization to actually recognize that even if they don't have a revolt on their hand, they probably still have a problem that they're just not aware of. And so awareness around gender inequalities and the fact that those inequalities, for example, might still exist, even though they don't have obvious differential in pay for the same work done by a man or a woman, they might still have gender pay gaps. They might still have inequalities such as a slower rate of promotion for women. That is not necessarily seen as being problematic, but I think, well, I think it is, and I think that's something that, if anything, if my work helps to raise awareness that those things are problematic, even though they're not perceived as being problematic a lot of the time, that would be already a success. So there's a couple of questions in the chat. Are you okay if I take some of those questions?
Okay.
Or Aeli, do you want to come in?
I suppose I've got some observations. I don't appear to be appearing, so I suppose actually, you know, being a female in the workplace, there is a kind of expectation as a woman that, as has been said on your board, women will juggle things. And so often there's an expectation you'll be responsible for a lot of things outside of work and you'll forego a career. And then within the workplace, women often seem to be put in a position where they're expected to volunteer for enabling / caring roles, which can be at the detriment to career progression, because they're not necessarily things which are recognized as strongly as maybe other things within an organization. I've also heard, and I think this is possibly true, that men will often be quite a bit more bullish about what they've done. So they'll apply for promotion at an earlier level and be successful, whereas women will tend to hold back, believing that they actually need to gain more skills, have more things before they go forward. And so it's kind of the encouraging of women to say, well, no, you've got lots of achievements, you should put yourself out there. You know, you should actually put yourself on the line and see how you go.
So I think, I mean, first, I think we have good evidence for the two things you were discussing. I mean, it's not research I've done myself, but there's good evidence that indeed there's a tendency to see women as more suitable for roles that involve care, and that's something that I would argue is as a result of gender status beliefs, that, you know, this is a role that is more suitable for a woman. And even though, you know, the way we think of gender specific roles today is not the same way we thought about it in the 60s or in the 80s, it still exists, and there's still perceptions of suitability, differential suitability for different types of role. And there's someone had indicated amongst the challenges the perceptions of women's times being less important. I think that's tied to like those caring roles, for example, tends to come with time that is difficult to compress. You can't do certain things more in a caring role where you have to talk to someone face to face, for example, to understand what their problem is. Well, you can't really speed up that face to face part of the role, and that means compared to other roles, those might be more time consuming, and therefore beyond not being seen as prestigious as other roles, they also take more time, and therefore mean time that can't be used to do other activities that are more rewarded by the organization. So that was the first part of your question. The second part of your question was about promotion. And we have good evidence indeed, as you were saying, that, and it wasn't in the context of promotion, but it was in the context of applying for jobs, looking at the list of skills that are required for a job. We have good evidence that men, and I'm not 100% sure my memory of the proportions are correct, but there was a differential. And I think men would apply for a job if they met 50% of the criteria, whereas women would only apply if they met 75% of the criteria. And that difference, I'm not 100% sure that it was 50 and 75, but there was a significant difference between the two. And of course, well, that significant difference then translate into, it's again occupational sorting showing its head. If you wait until you have 75% of the skills for a job that are in a job description to apply, that constrain what kind of jobs you can apply to more than if you go with a 50% rule. So there's a couple of questions in the chat. Should I take those now?
Yes, there is one question about Sarah. She says, how is age factored into the research, especially in terms of age and seniority?
So in the context of this research, we took age into account, as meaning that in our statistics, in our statistical models, we were controlling for age. But you are right that there are dynamics linked to age and to generational differences as well. And by that, I don't mean the pop version of generation millennials and Gen Xers, but simply the fact that people that are close in age might have similar experience, for example, of the labor market. The gender beliefs tend to be generational, and that means people that grew up at a specific time will have beliefs that are different from people that have grown up 20 years later. And those beliefs might change. A person can change their beliefs, but it's harder to change people's beliefs if they're further away from what you think is the right way to look at the problem, or what if someone has very traditional views of gender. It's unlikely that they will completely change their mind. They might come back towards a more moderate view, but it's unlikely they'll go all the way to thinking there shouldn't be any differences between men and women in terms of in the workplace.
Very nice.
So I just saw pop up in the chat. One of the thing I was not in the chat, sorry, on my slide. One of the thing I was recommending was promoting more women to leadership position, and someone is saying, well, sometimes that leads to backlash, and that is true, and that's one of the difficulty again of reducing those gender inequalities in the workplace, but also other types of inequalities in the workplace. It's because there might be backlash, and we don't really know. It's difficult to predict whether or not there will be backlash, and if there's backlash, the initiative ends up being inefficient and sometimes can be counterproductive, and therefore you go back to a worse situation than where you started from.
Okay, very interesting. I think we have answered all of the questions now. So Antoine, thank you very much for your presentation. Very important topic and very interesting findings. I will remember the gender status mismatch for a long time, I think. So thank you very much, and thank you to everyone who has participated and has been with us today.
Thank you very much. And before we close, just for all the people that were there in the audience, do reach out if you think we can help in addressing gender inequalities in your workplace. That's something we're very eager to help with. Thank you, everyone, for being there and for your attention today.